The deputy held the papers at arm's length, as if the ink might stain him. Behind him, two haulers slid a cast iron stove across a cabin floor, and the legs made a sound against the wood that was hard to forget, a long, slow scrape like a nail drawn across slate. A woman stood in the doorway holding a cracked lantern in the half-dark of a mountain morning. A mule pawed at frozen mud near a fence post, ribs showing through a coat too thin for the season. The deputy looked at the tree line. He looked at his boots. He looked at everything except the woman whose stove was on its way to the wagon. He told her she could collect personal effects before sundown. She asked what she was meant to cook with. No one answered. The bench land sat 12 wagon miles north of Glenwood Springs, at the edge of a pine-choked ridge where the basalt broke through the soil like black teeth. Lydia Venner had come west with her husband Emery 3 years before, following the promise of cheap ground and timber work near the new settlement. Emery hauled bridge beams for the rail gangs pushing toward the canyon. He was strong enough for that work until the lung fever found him in a wet camp along the Roaring Fork. He coughed for 11 days. On the 12th, he stopped. That left Lydia with an improvement claim on 40 acres of stony ground, a half-built cabin Emery had framed with green aspen logs, a mule too thin to sell, and a debt note held by the Roaring Fork Land and Loan Company. She was 38 years old. She had no children. Her nearest relatives lived in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, 1,500 miles and a lifetime east. She had come from Stone Country. Her father, a slate mason named Orrin Venner, had spent 40 years splitting rock in the Lehigh quarries. He taught Lydia two things before she turned 12, that stone remembers heat longer than wood, and that air moves through cracks the eye cannot find. She filed these lessons the way a child files most lessons, without understanding that they would one day matter more than anything else she knew. The debt note came due in late October of 1886. Lydia had expected another season to work the claim, to sell fence rails, and maybe a cord or two of aspen to the freight camps. But the Roaring Fork Land and Loan Company did not wait. Their clerk, a man named Merritt Klein, arrived on a Tuesday morning with Deputy Harlan Voss and two haulers driving an empty wagon. Klein did not knock. He stood at the edge of the cleared ground and called her name as if reading it from a list. Lydia came to the door holding a cracked lantern because the morning was still dark at that elevation. Button, the mule, stood tied to a fence post and pawed at the frozen mud. His ribs showed through a coat too thin for the season. Klein unfolded the note. He read the balance owed, $63.40, including interest and fees the company had added since Emery's death. He read it the way a man reads a grocery order. Then he told Lydia that the company would be collecting the improvements and stores attached to the debt, the stove, the flour barrel, the better of 2 blankets, and the hay she had cut and stacked for January. Lydia asked what she was meant to cook with. Klein said that was not a company concern. The haulers loaded the stove first. It took both of them and a plank to slide it onto the wagon bed, and when the iron legs scraped across the cabin floor, the sound was like a nail drawn across slate. One of the men grunted. The other looked at Lydia and then looked away. They took the flour barrel next, tilting it onto its rim and rolling it to the tailgate. Then the blanket, the good one, the wool one Emery's mother had sent from Ohio. Then the hay. 4 months of cutting and raking and drying, loaded in bundles and packed around the stove as if the hay existed to cushion the company's iron. Deputy Voss would not meet her eyes. He held the papers and looked at the tree line and said nothing except that she could collect personal effects before sundown. Klein smiled at that, as if sundown were generous. By noon, Lydia stood in a half-stripped cabin with no stove, no flour worth counting, and no legal right to remain on the land. She had $12.30 in a tin cup nailed behind a wallboard. She had 8 pounds of flour in a sack Klein's men had missed because it sat under a pile of mending rags. She had 3 pounds of dried beans, one skillet, one bedroll, one torn canvas wagon sheet, half a quart of wet aspen that would smoke more than burn, and button. She also had a mercury thermometer her father had used in the quarries, cracked at the top, but still reading true. She did not yet know this instrument would matter more than anything else she owned. The question was not whether Lydia could survive the winter. The question was where. The benchland offered a 7x9 lean-to that Emery had built as a tool shelter before starting the cabin. It had 3 walls of stacked aspen, a canvas roof patched with pine pitch, and no floor. It faced northwest, which meant every storm that came down the valley would drive snow and wind straight into the open side. Lydia dragged her bedroll into it that first night and lay awake listening to Button shift and grunt against his rope. The temperature dropped to 19 degrees by the time the stars appeared. She knew because she checked the thermometer 3 times, holding it close to the lantern flame each time as though the numbers might change. They did not change. 19 degrees, and winter had not truly started. The road south toward Glenwood Springs was already sheeted with ice, where the creek crossings washed over stone. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad would not reach Glenwood until the following October. Stage passage to Leadville cost money she did not have. She could not walk out carrying what she needed to survive the walk. She could not sell Button because no buyer would pay for a mule that thin, and even if one did, the sale would leave her on foot in country that punished anyone without an animal. There was no way out. Every door she tried was frozen shut. Ansel Crowther came the next morning. Crowther was 59 years old, a former freight road boss who had wintered teams over Tennessee Pass and dragged frozen hides out of draws after storms that killed cattle by the hundred. He lived 4 miles south in a tight log house with a stone chimney and a root cellar full of potatoes. He was not cruel. That was almost worse. Cruelty could be argued with. Practical certainty sat like a boulder in the road and did not move. He walked the property without asking permission. He looked at the lean-to. He crouched and tested the canvas roof with his thumb, pressing the fabric until the pitch cracked. He looked at the wet aspen stacked against the cabin's unfinished wall. He picked up a piece, smelled the cut end, and dropped it. He looked at the sky, which had turned the color of old iron. Then he looked at Lydia. "You have half a frame," Crowther said, pointing at Emery's cabin. "You cannot close it before snow sets. You have maybe 1.5 cords of aspen, wet, which will give you smoke and spit and not much else. You need 6 cords minimum of dry pine or spruce to hold through January and February alone. You have no stove. You have no hay for the mule. You have a lean-to that will not stop wind, a canvas roof that will hold snow until it collapses, and no floor beneath you to break the cold coming up from the ground." He said all of this while standing with his hands in his coat pockets, the way a man stands when he has already decided what he is looking at. Lydia asked him what he suggested. "Walk to Glenwood before the ice gets worse. Find a boarding room. Sell the mule for what you can get, even if it is $2. Write to your people back east and hope they can send passage money before March." Lydia told him the road was already dangerous, that she could not afford a boarding room, that Button would not bring $2 in this condition, and that she had no people back east who were in a position to help. Crowther nodded slowly. He had expected every part of that answer. "A lean-to is not a house," he said. "Half a cord is not fuel. A mule is not a miracle." He left her a pound of coffee, 2 candle stubs, and a look that said more than his words. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he expects to find frozen and still in the spring. Lydia stood in the lean-to that evening, and did the math for herself. She did it out loud, because saying the numbers made them heavier and she needed to feel their weight. A winter shelter in this country needed walls at least 12 by 14 feet, chinked tight enough to hold heat against wind that could blow for 3 days straight. It needed a working stove or a stone fireplace with a draw strong enough to pull smoke without pulling warmth. It needed 6 cords of dry wood minimum. She had half a cord of wet aspen. It needed food stores for 4 months, at minimum 40 pounds of flour, 20 of beans, salt, sugar, lard, dried meat. She had maybe 3 weeks of half rations if she ate nothing but thin bean soup and flat bread cooked without grease. She could not build a cabin alone. She could not buy a stove. She could not cut, split, and dry 6 cords of wood before the first real storm arrived. She could not walk out, ride out, or wait it out. The escape hatches were sealed. Everyone. The road was ice. The money was gone. The claim was stripped. The mule was starving. The community saw a woman who had already lost, still standing where the loss had happened. That night, Button did something strange. The mule had been tied to a fence post near the lean-to, and Lydia had dragged him close to block wind on the open side. His body made a better wall than the canvas. But Button fought the rope. He did not pull toward the valley road where other animals might be, or toward the creek where water ran under the ice. He pulled toward the pine thicket above the property, where the ridge climbed into a tumble of black basalt and scrub oak. Lydia cursed him and hauled him back. Button brayed, loud enough to carry across the clearing, and lunged again. She tied him shorter and went to sleep. On the second night, the mule broke his rope. Lydia woke to silence. No shifting, no grunting, no mule breath steaming against the canvas. She grabbed the lantern and followed his tracks in the frost up through the pines. The hoof prints were deep and deliberate, cutting uphill through frozen mud and overexposed rock. The tracks ended at a brush pile where deadfall and scrub oak covered a seam in the basalt. Lydia pushed through the brush, scratching her arms on dry branches, and found Button standing with his nose pressed flat against the rock. She pulled him back. He would not move. Then she felt it. Warm air coming from a crack in the stone, no wider than her forearm. Not hot, not steaming, just warm, the way a cellar wall feels in January when the ground above is frozen solid. The air smelled like minerals and wet clay and something faintly sulfurous, like old eggs left too long in a root cellar. Snowflakes landed on the rock near the crack and vanished. No frost clung to the stone within 3 feet of the opening. The basalt itself was warm to the touch, not burning, not uncomfortable, just warm. The kind of warmth that made Lydia pull her hand back in surprise and then put it back again to be sure. Her father's voice came back to her as clearly as if he were standing behind her in the dark. She was 8 years old, pressing her palm against the cellar wall of their house in Schuylkill County. Orrin Venner crouched beside her, holding a candle flame near a crack in the limestone foundation. The flame leaned, steadied, leaned again. Lime dust hung in the air. Her father's wool coat smelled like damp and stone. "Stone does not make heat," he had said, "but it holds it. It hides it. It breathes it. You find stone that breathes warm in January. You have found something the cold cannot take from you." Lydia knelt at the crack and held her lantern close. The flame tilted inward, then straightened. Air was moving, warm air rising from somewhere below the ridge. She widened the brush with her hands and found that the crack opened further behind the deadfall. Not a cave mouth, more like a wound in the ridge, a narrow fissure where the basalt had split and not healed. She could smell water. She could feel damp warmth on her face, the kind of warmth that made her skin prickle after hours in the cold. She could not see inside, but she knelt at the opening and held the thermometer in the moving air. After 2 minutes, she pulled it out and angled it toward the lantern. 59 degrees. Outside, the lean-to read 21. Lydia sat on the frozen ground with the thermometer in her lap and stared at the crack in the rock. 59 degrees in late October. While frost covered every surface within sight, and the lean-to would not keep a dog alive through January, she knew what the Glenwood country was. The Ute people had called it Yampa, big medicine, for the hot springs that steamed along the river below. Settlers had begun building bathhouses over the mineral pools near the new town. The ground here held heat the way a stove holds coals, deep, constant, rising through fissures in the rock wherever the earth had cracked open. The warm springs along the roaring fork were the same heat reaching the surface through different cracks. What Lydia had found was another crack, smaller, hidden under brush and pine, unknown to anyone except the mule that had followed the warmth by instinct. But knowing that the ground was warm did not mean a fissure was safe. Warm caves flood. Warm caves fill with gas that snuffs a candle and a person alike. Warm caves collapse when frost heaves the stone above. Warm caves attract animals that do not welcome company. A woman crawling into a warm hole in the ground was not being clever. She might be crawling into a coffin that smelled like eggs. Lydia checked the thermometer one more time. 59 degrees. She held the candle flame at the opening again. The flame leaned inward, then steadied. The air was moving. Moving air meant ventilation. Ventilation meant the fissure was not a sealed pocket of dead gas. It breathed. The lean-to would kill her. That was certain. The cold was already 19 degrees and would reach 20 below or worse by January. She had no stove, no fuel worth burning, and no walls that would hold heat. She would freeze. Maybe not this week. Maybe not next week. But before Christmas, the lean-to would finish what Klein had started. The fissure might kill her. That was possible. But possible was not certain. And the difference between certain death and possible death was the only math that mattered. She had one question left. Was this a refuge or a grave with a draft? The next morning, Lydia crawled inside. She went head first because the opening was too narrow for any other approach, dragging the lantern behind her on a rope. The stone scraped her shoulders. Her coat caught on a ledge and tore at the seam. She freed it and kept moving. 10 feet in, the fissure widened. She could kneel. 15 feet in, she could stand, though the ceiling pressed close enough to brush her hair. The air was thick with moisture and mineral smell, but the candle flame burned steady. No guttering, no dimming, no sudden lean that would mean gas pooling low. The draft came from somewhere deeper, a slow current that carried warmth and the faint sound of dripping water. The chamber was roughly 12 feet wide and 20 feet deep, narrowing at the far end where the basalt pinched together. The floor was uneven, loose scree, flat slabs, a shallow trough where water had carved a channel through softer stone. The walls were damp but not dripping. The temperature was constant, 59 degrees at shoulder height, slightly warmer near the floor where geothermal air rose through cracks in the stone. It was not comfortable. It was not safe. It was not a home by any definition Lydia had ever used, but it was 40 degrees warmer than the lean-to, and it was free. Lydia sat in the chamber for 20 minutes and worked the problem the way her father worked stone, one face at a time. The entrance was too exposed. Wind would funnel through the crack and strip the warmth. The floor was wet. Sleeping on stone that channeled water would kill as surely as cold. The air might be safe now, but a sealed entrance could change the ventilation and trap bad gas. Animals might already use this space. She needed to wall the entrance against wind without sealing the airflow. She needed to raise her sleeping surface above the waterline. She needed to test the air at different depths. She needed to keep the mule close enough to benefit from the warmth, but far enough that his damp and waste did not foul the sleeping chamber. The design came to her the way her father's walls had taken shape. From the ground up, one problem solved at a time. A dry stone wind wall across the entrance, 4 feet high, 20 inches thick at the base, tapering slightly. A palm-wide upper vent left open so air could circulate, enough draft to keep the fissure breathing, not enough to let wind steal the warmth. A shallow drainage runnel scratched into the rock to carry condensation away from the sleeping platform. The old canvas wagon sheet hung as an inner curtain behind the wall, trapping a second layer of still air. A sleeping platform raised 18 inches off the floor on spruce poles. The mule in the outer chamber between the entrance wall and the brush screen, where his body heat would add warmth, but his damp would not reach the inner space. No fire inside the cave except at the entrance, and only in calm weather when the draft pulled smoke outward. It was not an invention. It was an assembly of old knowledge applied to a specific hole in the ground. Her father had built stone walls. Miners had survived underground for centuries. Animals had found warm rock before humans ever thought to look. But no one had told Lydia Venner to do any of this. No one had drawn a plan. She was staring at a crack in a ridge and calculating whether the earth itself could keep her alive when everything above it had been taken away. The risk was real. Tamsin Dacey made sure Lydia understood that. Tamsin lived 3 miles east on a ranch her husband worked for a cattle company. She was 32, had 2 children under 8, and carried herself with the hard practicality of a woman who could not afford to be wrong about anything. She saw Lydia hauling flat stones up the ridge trail 2 days after the discovery, and followed her far enough to see the brush screen and the faint shimmer of vapor rising behind it. A hole can warm a fox and still bury a woman, Tamsin said. She stood at the edge of the brush with her arms crossed and her breath smoking in the cold air. She was not mocking. She was worried. Worry made her blunt. Lydia told her the temperature inside was 59 degrees. Tamsin asked how she planned to eat rock. "I do not plan to eat rock," Lydia said. "I plan to sleep where rock holds warmth and cook where wind allows fire." "Caves flood," Tamsin said. "Caves fill with gas that puts you down before you smell it. Caves drop stone on your head while you sleep. You are a widow with a mule, not a miner." Lydia said she knew the risks. "You know the word for them," Tamsin said. "That is not the same as knowing the weight." She left. Lydia watched her walk down the trail with her shoulders tight and her hands balled in her coat pockets. Tamsin was right about every individual danger she named. Caves do flood. Caves do trap gas. Caves do collapse. But Tamsin was comparing cave risk to cabin safety, and Lydia no longer had a cabin. She was comparing cave risk to the open-air certainty of freezing to death in a lean-to that would not survive the first real storm. The lean-to would kill her. The fissure might kill her. Might was better than would. Lydia checked the thermometer one last time that evening. 59 inside, 17 outside. The gap was 42 degrees of warmth the earth was giving away for free to anyone willing to crawl through the dark to get it. She began hauling stone. Word traveled. It always does in country with few people, and nothing to talk about except weather and each other. By the end of the first week, the settlement near Glenwood Springs knew that the Venner widow had gone into a hole in the ridge with her mule and was stacking rocks across the mouth like a woman building a fort. At the store, men shook their heads. One said she was wintering with a mule in a crack. Another said grief had turned her mind. A third said it was not his business if a woman wanted to freeze underground instead of above ground, but he wished she had picked a place where the body would be easier to find in spring. Merritt Klein heard all of this and said nothing at the store. He said it privately, to the people who mattered. He told Tamsin Dacey that if Lydia died in the hills, no one could say she had not been warned. He told the deputy that the Venner woman might be trespassing on land the company had a right to reclaim. He told the store owner that extending credit to a woman living in a cave was the same as lending money to a ghost. Klein's interest was not compassion, it was land. The bench where Lydia's claim sat was rumored to be along the route where the Denver and Rio Grande would push through when the railroad finally reached Glenwood Springs. That arrival was expected the following year, in the fall of 1887. If Lydia abandoned her claim, froze out, or was declared too incompetent to maintain her improvements, the company could acquire the rights and resell them at prices inflated by proximity to rail. Every week Lydia survived was a week Klein's speculation stalled. He followed her to the store on the day she spent her last real money. She bought a pint of lamp oil and 3 pounds of salt pork with coins. She counted out one at a time from a knotted cloth. Klein stood behind her at the counter and watched her hands, split across the knuckles, the right thumbnail missing, stone dust ground into every crease. The company will be obliged to collect any remaining property left on the seized parcel, he said. His voice was pleasant, the way a pleasant voice can be when it carries a knife inside it. Lydia said the mule was not company property. Klein smiled. A starving mule is hardly property at all. She picked up her oil and salt pork and left the store without answering him. She did not have an answer that would change anything. Arguments required someone willing to listen, and Klein was not a listener. He was a ledger. He added columns and subtracted people, and when the balance came out in his favor, he smiled exactly as he was smiling now. So Lydia stopped trying to convince anyone. She stopped arguing. She stopped defending what she was doing. She hauled stone. The first day of real construction taught her what Ansel Crowther already knew. Building with rock is not the same as building with wood, and a woman working alone moves stone the way water moves it, slowly, steadily, and at great cost to the thing doing the moving. She started with the entrance wall. The basalt near the fissure broke in flat slabs when she struck it with the back of her axe head, and she carried these slabs 2 and 3 at a time up the short slope to the opening. Each slab weighed between 15 and 40 pounds. She needed the wall to stand 4 feet high and 20 inches thick at the base. That meant hundreds of stones set in courses, each one carried by hand, fitted by eye, and tapped into place with a smaller stone until it seated. Her father had taught her the principle: broad base, tight joints, no running cracks. Each stone had to bridge the joint below it so no vertical gap ran from top to bottom. Each course had to lean slightly inward to resist wind pressure pushing against the face. The small wedge stones packed between the face stones had to fill every gap so the wall would not shift when weight pressed from either side. By the end of the first day, she had set 7 feet of base course. Her hands were split along the knuckles, where the rough basalt caught skin. Blood dried brown in the cold air. Her shoulders ached from lifting, and her lower back seized when she bent too quickly. She had eaten one meal, flat bread cooked on the skillet over a small fire outside the fissure entrance, and drunk snow melt warmed in the same skillet. Button stood in the outer chamber watching her with the flat, patient stare of an animal that has decided to wait and see what the human does next. Day 2. More stone. The second course went slower because the stones had to be selected more carefully, each one fitted to the shape beneath it. Lydia turned each piece 3 or 4 times before setting it, testing the seat with her palm, tapping it with a smaller stone to feel whether it wobbled. The wall rose in inches. Day 3. 7 feet of wall base extended to 8, spanning the full width of the fissure entrance. The second course was half complete. Her right thumbnail torn free when a slab shifted and caught her fingers between 2 courses. She rapped with a strip torn from her undershirt. The cloth turned brown within an hour. The weather held, but it held the way a man holds a stone above his head. You could see the effort, and you knew it would not last. The sky over the canyon wall had turned the color of dirty wool. The pines on the ridge moved in gusts that came more frequently each day, and between gusts the air had a weight to it, a thickness that pressed against the skin. Lydia checked the thermometer every morning. Outside readings dropped. 21, 18, 15. Inside the fissure, the temperature remained steady. 58 degrees. 59. But on one morning, when the wind blew hard enough to push cold air through the unfinished wall, the reading inside dropped to 57, 2 degrees. It should not have mattered. But it did. If wind through an unfinished wall could force the chamber temperature down 2 degrees, a full blizzard hammering a wall with gaps in the upper courses could strip the warmth far worse. The wall was not a suggestion. The wall was the line between shelter and a hole in the ground. She worked faster. Her hands bled. She worked through the bleeding. By day 5, the canvas hung behind the third course of stone, rigged on a rope strung between 2 iron spikes she had driven into the basalt on either side of the entrance. The canvas billowed when wind gusted against the outside of the wall, but behind it, the air went still. She held the thermometer at shoulder height behind the canvas. 60 degrees. The second layer of still air was working. Cold wind hit the stone wall, slowed, hit the canvas curtain, slowed again, and by the time it reached the inner chamber, it carried nothing worse than a faint draft. On the 6th day, Lydia built the sleeping platform. She cut 4 spruce poles and wedged them between rock ledges on either side of the inner chamber, then laid smaller branches across them and covered the frame with spruce boughs and a scrap of remaining canvas. The platform sat 18 inches above the floor, above the water channel, above the coldest layer of air that settled along the stone, above the damp that would rot a bedroll in 3 days. She tested it that night. She lay on the platform with the bedroll beneath her and the wool blanket, the thin one, the one Klein's men had not taken over her. The thermometer read 58 degrees at platform height. Below the platform, where water seeped along the drainage runnel she had scratched in the rock with the axe blade, it was 52. Above her, where warm air collected against the low ceiling, it was 61. 58 degrees. She lay still and felt the warmth settle around her like a coat she had not owned in weeks. It was the first night since the seizure that Lydia did not shiver until dawn. But the wall was not finished. The upper courses still had gaps where she had run out of flat stones and filled with round ones that did not seat properly. The palm-wide vent she had left for airflow needed a stone lintel to keep it from collapsing under the weight of the final course. And the mule's chamber, the space between the entrance wall and the brush screen, still needed its floor cleared of sharp basalt fragments so Button would not split his already cracked hooves. She needed more time. The sky said she did not have it. The pines on the ridge had begun to make a sound Lydia had not heard before, a low, constant moan that came not from gusts, but from a steady wind that did not stop between gusts. It blew all day and all night, pressing against the trees until the trunks bent and held their bend. The freight teams on the valley road below had thinned to 1 or 2 a day, then to none. A rider passing through toward the lower country told the store owner that cattle were drifting south in blind herds, pushed by weather they could sense coming before any person could name it. Lydia stood at the fissure entrance on the morning of the seventh day and looked at her unfinished wall, 3.5 feet high, gaps in the upper courses where the wind whistled through, no lintel over the vent, Button pawing at loose scree behind her, shifting his weight from hoof to hoof the way a nervous animal does when the air carries something wrong. She had built enough to survive a cold night. She had not built enough to survive what was coming, and something was coming. She could feel it the way the cattle felt it, the way Button felt it, a pressure in the sky, a weight in the wind, a silence underneath the moaning pines that meant the world was holding its breath before it screamed. She had days, maybe a week. She did not know how many, and the not knowing was worse than any number. Lydia picked up the next stone. It was flat, heavy, and cold enough to burn her split hands. She set it on the fourth course and reached for another. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? The wall grew one stone at a time, and somewhere behind it, the mountain breathed warm and steady and patient, giving heat it would not miss to a woman the world above had already written off. The question was whether the wall would close before the sky opened. Lydia did not know the answer. She only knew the next stone and the one after that, and the sound of the wind rising in the pines like something learning to howl. Rowan Priest found Lydia on the 9th day. She was sitting on a flat rock below the ridge trail, trying to reset a broken axe handle with rawhide strips and ash wedges. The handle had split lengthwise where the grain ran crooked, and the head wobbled with every strike. She had been using this axe to shape basalt slabs for the upper courses, and without it, she would be fitting stone by hand, slower, less precise, and harder on fingers already split to the quick. Priest came up the trail from the direction of the freight road, limping on a left leg that bent wrong at the knee. He was 62 years old, Cornish Welsh by birth, and he had spent 30 years underground in the mines of Cornwall, Butte, and Leadville before a mishandled blast charge shattered his kneecap and ended his digging life. Now he sharpened tools for freightmen and blacksmiths around Glenwood Springs, and he walked the country because walking was the only thing that kept the knee from locking solid. He stopped when he saw the axe. He did not ask her name. He did not ask what she was building. He crouched beside her, slowly, the bad knee grinding, and looked at the way she had wrapped the rawhide. She had soaked the strips in water and wound them tight around the split, then packed ash between the halves to fill the gap before the rawhide dried and shrank. "You have done this before," Priest said. Lydia told him her father was a mason who fixed his own tools. "A mason," Priest said. He looked at her hands, the stone dust ground into every crease, the torn thumbnail wrapped in cloth, the calluses building over raw skin. Then he looked up the ridge, where the trail disappeared into the pines. "What are you building up there that needs a mason's daughter and no mason?" Lydia did not answer immediately. She had stopped explaining what she was doing after Tamsin's visit and Klein's threat. Explanations invited argument, and argument cost time she did not have. But something in Priest's voice was different. He was not asking the way Crowther asked, with the verdict already formed. He was not asking the way Tamsin asked, with worry pushing the words. He was asking the way a man asks who has spent his life underground and knows that the ground sometimes offers what the surface refuses. She told him about the fissure, the warm air, the thermometer readings, the wall she was building. Priest listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question. "Have you tested the air at the lowest point?" Lydia said she had tested with a candle flame. It burned steady. Priest shook his head. A candle tells you whether you can breathe right now. It does not tell you what happens when you seal the entrance, and the warm air stacks, and the heavy air settles. I have seen men walk into drifts that smelled fine and lay down dead in 2 minutes because the bad air sits on the floor like water in a basin. He stood up, the knee cracking, and looked at the ridge. "Show me," he said. They climbed together, Lydia moving quickly through the pines, and Priest following with the deliberate gait of a man who has learned that rushing underground gets people killed. At the fissure entrance, he stopped. He did not go inside. He stood at the mouth and watched the warm air bead moisture on the cold rock. He held his hand in the draft. He held it at knee height, then waist height, then above his head. "The warm air rises," he said. "That is good. That means you have circulation. The warm comes up, the cold falls, the air turns. But you must never trust it. You must test it every time you go deeper than the entrance." He took one of Lydia's candle stubs, lit it, and lowered it to the floor of the fissure on a piece of twine. The flame burned. He lowered it into the drainage runnel, where the air sat coldest. The flame burned, but it shrank, smaller, dimmer, a tight blue ring around the wick. "There," Priest said. "That is where the heavy air collects. If you ever see that flame go out, you leave. You do not stop to gather your blanket. You do not stop for the mule. You leave." He straightened and looked at the wall she had built. 3.5 feet of dry stone courses, 20 inches thick at the base, canvas hung behind the third course. He ran his hand along the face stones. He pressed against the wall with both palms and leaned his weight into it. The wall held. "Who taught you to set hardened stones?" he asked. Lydia said her father. "Your father was a good mason." He pointed at a section where the upper course had a running joint, a vertical gap that lined up with the gap below it, creating a weakness that wind or weight could split. "But here you have a crack that runs. If wind hits this wall at full force, this is where it fails. Reset these 3 stones so the joints break." Lydia looked at the section. She saw it immediately. The mistake was obvious once someone pointed to it, and invisible until then. Priest made her one offer. He did not frame it as charity, and Lydia would not have accepted charity. He said, "I will teach you what keeps miners alive underground if you stop trusting courage where air is concerned. Courage underground is how men die." He came the next morning and taught her the first lesson. Air reading. He brought a second candle and showed her how to hold 2 flames at different heights inside the fissure, one at head height, one at knee height. If both burned the same, the air was mixing. If the lower flame dimmed or changed color, heavy gas was settling. He made her wait at the entrance for 10 full minutes before entering each time, watching the flames, smelling the air, feeling for changes in the draft. "Underground is patient," Priest said. "It will wait for you to get comfortable before it kills you." The second lesson came on day 11, dry stone locking. Priest showed Lydia how to set the broad base stones with a slight backward lean, so gravity pressed them into the hillside rather than away from it. He showed her how to pack hardened stones behind the face stones so tightly that a knife blade could not fit between them. He made her tear out the running joint section and reset it, breaking each vertical joint with a stone that overlapped by at least 1/3 of its width. "A wall is not a pile," he said. "A pile leans on itself. A wall leans on the ground." He could not lift the heavy slabs himself. His arms were strong from decades of mining, but his knee buckled under load, and Lydia saw him grit his teeth when he tried to carry anything heavier than a tool. So she carried the stones, and he told her where to set them. It was collaboration built on unequal bodies and mutual respect. She had strength, and endurance. He had knowledge that only comes from years spent in the dark. The third lesson came on day 12, and it may have saved Lydia's life. Condensation control. Priest pointed to the damp patches on the chamber walls and the thin film of water that covered the sleeping platform's spruce boughs each morning. Warm air from the fissure met cold stone and released its moisture the way breath fogs on glass. That moisture-soaked bedding, rotted food, chilled the body through wet cloth, and turned a warm shelter into a slow drowning. He took Lydia's axe and cut a shallow runnel, a groove in the stone floor no wider than 2 fingers, from the rear of the chamber toward the entrance. The runnel followed the natural slope of the floor, so water ran downhill and out. Then he showed her how to angle the sleeping platform spruce poles so any drip from the ceiling fell off the edge rather than pooling in the center. "The warm air wants to give you its water," Priest said. "Let it, but make the water go where you want, not where it wants." He coughed as he said it. A single cough, deep in his chest, that he covered with a rag and stuffed back in his pocket before Lydia could see what the rag held. She saw anyway. The edge of the rag was dark, not dirt dark, blood dark. She did not ask. Priest did not explain. They kept working. By day 13, the wall stood 4 feet high with the vent opening properly framed by a flat stone lintel that distributed the weight of the final course across the gap. The canvas curtain hung tight behind the wall. The drainage runnel ran clean. The sleeping platform was dry. The mule's outer chamber had been cleared of sharp scree, and Button stood on packed dirt with a canvas windbreak rigged between 2 stones. Lydia ran the thermometer at 3 points. Rear chamber, 60 degrees. Sleeping platform, 58. Entrance, behind the wall, 46. Outside, in the pines, 14 degrees. The temperatures were falling faster now, dropping 3 or 4 degrees a night and recovering less each day. The sun rose later, set earlier, and carried less warmth between. Snow had fallen twice, light, dry dustings that melted by noon, but the clouds building over the canyon wall were not dusting clouds. They were heavy, dark, and stacked in layers that meant the sky was loading itself with something it intended to drop all at once. Priest saw the clouds, too. He sat on a stump outside the fissure entrance, breathing hard from the climb, and watched them build. "How much food do you have?" he asked. Lydia told him 4 pounds of flour, 2 pounds of beans, 1.5 pounds of salt pork, coffee enough for a week, and whatever Button did not eat of the cracked corn she had been feeding him in handfuls. Priest nodded. "That is not enough." Lydia said she knew. "But it is more than nothing. I have seen men survive on less when the shelter was sound." He looked at the wall, then at the vent, then at the sky. "Your shelter is sound. Your food is short. Your wall is good, but untested. The question is what happens when the wind hits the entrance square and the snow packs against the stone." He coughed again, longer this time. He turned away and pressed the rag to his mouth, and his shoulders shook with the effort of keeping the sound quiet. When he turned back, his eyes were wet, but not from emotion, from effort. "I will come back before the storm," he said. "I want to check the vent draw under wind." He limped down the trail, and Lydia watched him until the pines swallowed his shape. She noticed he walked slower going down than he had coming up. Going up, a man could blame the knee. Going down, slowness meant something else. The setbacks came in a cluster, the way bad things do when time is short. On day 14, Button panicked at the cave throat. Lydia had been leading him from the outer chamber to a patch of brown grass below the ridge, and when she turned him at the narrow entrance, his hindquarters hit the stone wall and he kicked. His rear hoof caught Lydia on the left shoulder and spun her into the basalt. She felt something grind in the joint, not a break, not a dislocation, but a deep, sick shift that made her left arm useless for lifting for 2 full days. She spent those days fitting small stones one-handed, working with her right arm while the left hung and throbbed. On day 15, condensation soaked her bedding. A shift in the overnight wind had pushed cold air against the ceiling above the platform, and the temperature difference between the warm rising air and the cold stone produced a steady drip that found the one gap in her spruce bough ceiling and ran directly onto her blanket. She woke soaked and shivering at 3 in the morning, and she could not get warm again until she rebuilt the fire at the entrance and dried the blanket over a stick, turning it every 20 minutes for 4 hours. On day 16, a section of the upper wall collapsed. 3 stones from the fourth course slid outward in the night, knocked loose by wind pressure that found a weakness where the harding had not been packed tight enough. The stones fell onto Button's side of the outer chamber, and the mule went wild, braying and stamping until Lydia calmed him by covering his eyes with a feed sack. A trick Priest had mentioned offhand, the way a miner blindfolds a mule in a tunnel to keep it from bolting. She reset the stones that morning, packing the hardings so tight her fingers bled from pressing wedges into gaps no wider than a fingernail. The wall was stronger after the repair than before. She knew this because Priest had taught her that a wall rebuilt is a wall understood, and a wall understood does not fail the same way twice, but the failures cost time. And time was the one resource falling faster than the temperature. On the evening of day 16, Lydia found something at the head of the ridge trail that made her stop and stand still for a long time. A burlap sack, tied shut with twine, sitting on a flat rock where the trail turned upward from the valley. Inside, 10 pounds of cracked corn and 2 pounds of dried venison. No note. No name. But in the snow beside the rock, 2 mitten prints where someone had set the sack down and pressed their hands into the drift to push themselves back up. Small hands. A woman's hands. Mitten prints she had seen before on the trail rail outside Tamsin Dacey's ranch. Lydia carried the sack up the ridge and said nothing about it to anyone. She fed Button 3 handfuls of cracked corn that night and watched him eat with the calm greed of an animal that does not understand generosity but understands grain. Tamsin had not changed her mind about the cave. She had changed her mind about letting someone starve. The difference mattered. On day 18, Lydia set the last stone. The wall stood 4 feet and 2 inches high, 20 inches thick at the base, tapering to 14 at the top. The vent opening measured 5 inches wide by 3 inches tall, framed by the flat stone lintel, and angled slightly downward on the outer face so rain and snow melt would drip away from the gap rather than into it. The canvas curtain hung 6 inches behind the wall on its rope, creating a dead air space that stopped drafts cold. Priest climbed the ridge that morning, slower than before, stopping twice to catch his breath against tree trunks. He arrived at the fissure entrance and spent 20 minutes examining the wall. He pressed against it. He peered into the harding joints with a candle. He held a thread from his glove against the vent and watched it move. "The vent draws," he said. "The thread moves outward, which means warm air inside is pushing bad air out. If the thread ever stops moving or pulls inward, the circulation has failed. Do not seal this vent, not for warmth, not for wind, not for any reason. If this vent closes, you are not in a shelter. You are in a bottle." He looked at the rear chamber. The thermometer on the sleeping platform read 60 degrees. The floor runnel was dry, no overnight drip. The spruce boughs smelled clean. Button stood in the outer chamber, calm, his breath no longer smoking because the air around him held at 46 degrees. Priest sat on the stump outside and looked at the sky. The clouds had not broken in 3 days. They sat on the canyon rim like a gray ceiling, pressing lower each morning, swallowing the upper peaks. Ravens flew below the cloud line in tight circles, landing early and staying down. "You have done good work," Priest said. "The wall is sound, the air moves, the water runs where you told it to run." He paused. He looked at the clouds again. "But warmth does not equal safety. Storms do not kill by cold alone. They kill by keeping help away. If you are sealed in here for 3 days, 5 days, a week, the warmth will hold. The food may not. The air may not. The mule may not." Ansel Crowther appeared at the base of the ridge trail that afternoon, as if the approaching storm had drawn every skeptic out of the valley for one last look. Crowther climbed without speaking. At the fissure entrance, he stood before the wall and said nothing for a long time. Then he reached out and placed his palm flat against the stone. Warmth seeped through the joints. "It is warmer inside," he said. Lydia told him the readings. 60 degrees in the rear, 14 outside. Crowther nodded slowly. "Warm is not safe," he said. "I have seen warm men die because warm made them careless. You have a wall and a mule and a crack in the ground. That is better than a lean-to. It is not better than a cabin, a stove, and 6 cords of dry pine." He looked at the sky. "What is coming will not care about your thermometer." He left without offering help, but he left something more valuable than help. He left doubt that had cracked. He had come to look. A man certain that a thing will fail does not climb a ridge to see it. That night the wind stopped. Not gradually, not in gusts that grew further apart. The wind stopped the way a voice stops mid-sentence, and the silence it left was worse than any sound. The pines stood motionless. No branch moved. No snow fell. The air was still and heavy and tasted like iron, and the sky pressed so low that the canyon walls disappeared into cloud. Button stood in his chamber and would not eat. He brayed once, a long rising sound that carried across the ridge and came back as an echo, and then he stood still and trembled. Lydia knew what stillness before a storm meant. Her father had told her about the great blizzards in Pennsylvania, how the air went dead and sweet before the worst ones, how animals refused food and pressed against walls and shook as if something was coming that they could hear and humans could not. She checked the wall. She checked the vent. She checked the food stores, the flour in its niche, the beans in a cloth bag hung from a spruce pole, the salt pork wrapped in canvas, the cracked corn in the burlap sack. She checked the drainage runnel. She moved the bedding to the center of the platform where no drip could reach. She piled extra spruce boughs against the base of the wall where wind might force snow through the joints. Then she sat on the platform in the warm dark and listened to the silence. It lasted until morning. Then the world ended. The storm did not arrive. It detonated. 1 hour the pines stood still. The next they bent double, and the air between them filled with snow so thick it erased the sky, the trees, the ground, and every boundary between them. Lydia opened the brush screen to check the trail and could not see her own hand at arm's length. The snow was not falling. It was flying, horizontal, driven by wind that did not gust but roared in a single continuous scream that made the basalt hum. She pulled the brush screen closed and backed into the outer chamber. Button was pressed against the far wall, head down, shaking. Snow powder had already forced its way through the brush and was building a drift against the entrance wall. The canvas curtain behind the wall billowed inward, snapping against its rope, and fine white powder sprayed through the joints in the upper courses. Lydia grabbed the spruce boughs she had piled and jammed them into the gaps. The snow kept coming. She could feel the wind pressing against the wall like a hand, steady and enormous, and the stones shifted, not falling, not yet, but trembling in their seats the way a table trembles when someone leans too hard. The thermometer inside the rear chamber read 55 degrees. It had been 60 that morning. The wind was forcing cold air through the wall faster than the earth could warm it. She checked the vent. The thread Priest had left hanging from a nail near the opening still moved, outward, steady, the warm air inside still pushing. The vent was clear, but the sound coming through it was a sound she had never heard, a high, thin whistle that rose and fell with the gusts, as if the mountain itself were screaming through a 5-inch gap. The first hour passed. The drift against the entrance wall grew to 18 inches. Lydia shoveled snow away from the base with her skillet, pushing it through the brush screen into the outer wind, where it vanished instantly. Her hands went numb. She pulled them inside her coat and pressed them against her stomach and waited until feeling returned, then shoveled again. The second hour. Button refused to stand. He folded his legs and lay on the packed dirt of the outer chamber, and his body heat, trapped between the wall and the brush screen, raised the temperature in his space from 38 to 41 degrees. The mule's warmth was not charity. It was physics. The third hour. A pounding on the stone. Lydia froze. The pounding came again. Not wind, not falling rock. A fist. Someone was hitting the entrance wall from outside. She pulled the canvas curtain aside and pressed her ear against the stone. Through the howling, she heard a voice. A woman's voice. Tamsin Dacey's voice, screaming a name that the wind tore apart before it reached the second syllable. Lydia pulled the spruce boughs from the upper joints and looked through the gap. She could see nothing. White, roaring white, and then a shape. Tamsin, bent double against the wind, holding something against her chest, a bundle wrapped in a quilt. The bundle was Oren, Tamsin's youngest boy, 5 years old. His face was the color of tallow. Lydia did not think. She pulled 3 stones from the upper course and reached through the gap and grabbed Tamsin's coat collar. Tamsin pushed the boy through first. Lydia caught him, and the weight of the limp child nearly buckled her injured shoulder. Then Tamsin climbed over the lowered wall, falling into the outer chamber and landing on her hands and knees in the packed snow. Behind Tamsin, another shape. Ansel Crowther, covered in ice, his beard frozen into a solid mask, his eyes the only part of his face that moved. He climbed the wall without help and dropped inside and stood swaying like a man who has forgotten how to stop walking. Found them at the creek cut, Crowther said. His voice was flat, spent. Boy collapsed. She was carrying him toward the ridge. I saw the vapor through the snow. The vapor, the warm breath of the fissure leaking through the brush screen, had been visible through the blizzard as a dark shimmer against the white, the only landmark on a ridge where every other feature had been erased. Lydia took Oren and carried him to the sleeping platform. The boy was burning with fever. His skin was hot where his body fought the sickness, and cold where the storm had found exposed flesh. His hands were white at the fingertips. His lips were cracked and dry. She wrapped him in her bedroll and placed him at the center of the platform, away from the walls and the drip line. The thermometer beside him read 53 degrees. It had been 60 that morning and 55 an hour ago. 3 more people and an open wall had dropped the chamber temperature 7 degrees in minutes. Tamsin crouched beside the platform and pressed her palm to Oren's forehead. Her hands were shaking. She was soaked through. The quilt, her coat, her dress, all of it heavy with melted snow and sweat. His fever started yesterday, Tamsin said. Asa went to find the cattle. He did not come back. I could not keep the fire. The chimney draft reversed and the cabin filled with smoke. I remembered. She stopped. She looked at the stone walls, the warm air, the candle burning steady. She had remembered the warm hole in the ridge that she had told Lydia was a grave. You remembered, Lydia said. That was enough. She rebuilt the 3 stones she had pulled from the upper course. The wall closed again. The canvas settled. Within 10 minutes, the thermometer climbed from 53 to 54. Slowly. Too slowly. 4 people, a mule, and a fever in a space designed for 1 woman and her animal. Priest was already inside. He had come before the storm to check the vent, as he had promised. He sat in the rear of the chamber, his back against the warm stone, his coat pulled tight around his chest. He had not spoken when Tamsin and Crowther arrived. He had not moved. He sat and watched and breathed with the careful, measured rhythm of a man for whom breathing had become labor. Do not seal the vent, he said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise of wind and the child's rasping breath and Tamsin's shaking. The boy needs air. The mule needs air. You need air. If that vent closes, we die warm instead of cold, and warm death is still death. Lydia checked the vent. Snow was packing against the outside of the lintel, narrowing the gap. She pushed a spruce pole through the opening and scraped the snow clear. The whistle resumed. The thread moved outward. The first night inside the sealed chamber with 4 people and a mule was a negotiation between warmth and air, space and need, panic and patience. Button could smell the new people and the sick child and the fear in the air, and he lunged against his rope. His hooves struck the wall once, twice, and on the 3rd strike, Lydia thought a stone would come loose. She grabbed the feed sack from the supply niche and pulled it over Button's head, covering his eyes the way Priest had taught her. The mule stood still. The blindfold did not calm him. It confused him, and confusion was quieter than fear. Snow plugged the drainage runnel overnight. Water that should have run downhill and out of the chamber backed up and crept under the sleeping platform. Lydia woke to wet spruce boughs and a boy shivering on a damp bedroll. She used the axe handle to clear the runnel, chipping ice and packed grit from the groove until water flowed again. The effort took 30 minutes, and by the time she finished, her knees were soaked and her hands cramped from gripping cold stone. Tamsin dried Oren's blankets by holding them near the rear wall, where the warmest air rose. The wool steamed. It took an hour to dry 1 blanket, and they had 2. The first night became the first day. The storm did not stop. The wind did not slow. The snow did not thin. Through the vent, Lydia could hear nothing except the same continuous roar, as if the entire sky were being torn in half, and the sound had no beginning and no end. She rationed. She measured the flour with a tin cup and divided it into portions. Enough for 6 flat cakes a day, 3 for the adults and 3 for the boy. She boiled beans in the skillet at the entrance, where a small fire could be lit in the sheltered space between the wall and the brush screen. The smoke curled outward through the brush. The fire lasted 20 minutes before the wind gusted through and scattered it. Priest did not eat. Lydia brought him a flat cake and he held it, but did not raise it to his mouth. She saw him press the rag to his lips once, and when he lowered it, the rag was red. Not brown, red. Eat, she said. I am resting, he said. On the 2nd day, the temperature outside dropped below 0. Lydia could not check the thermometer outside the wall because she could not reach through the vent gap without losing feeling in her hand within seconds. She checked inside. 56 degrees in the rear chamber, 44 by the wall. Button's chamber held at 39 and cold, but the mule's body heat and the residual warmth from the fissure kept it above killing cold. Crowther sat with his back against the entrance wall and watched the vent thread. He watched it the way a man watches a pulse. The thread moved outward, 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 still moving. On the second evening, Crowther told Lydia what he had seen on the way up the ridge. 2 cattle, frozen upright in a draw, their noses buried in a drift. They had walked into the snow and died standing. A line of fence posts marking where the road should be, each one crowned with a shelf of ice so thick the posts looked like crosses. A silence from the valley that meant the cabins were sealed and the stoves were burning through wood at a rate that would leave families short before February. "What they are doing down there," Crowther said, "is burning everything they have to stay warm. 6 cords of dry pine, some of them stacked 8. They will go through it because the wind pulls the heat out through every crack in every wall, and the stove has to fight the wind for every degree." He looked at the stone walls. He looked at the thermometer. 56 degrees, no stove, no fire in the rear chamber, no wood burning at all. "You are not fighting the wind," he said. "The wind is fighting the mountain, and the mountain is winning." Lydia said nothing. She did not need to. The thermometer was saying it for her. If you are invested in this story, subscribe and stay with us, because what Lydia does next changes more than her own life. On the 3rd morning, Oren's fever broke. Tamsin felt his forehead, and his skin was damp and cool, and his breathing had shifted from the shallow rasp of fever to the long, slow rhythm of actual sleep. She sat on the edge of the platform and pressed both hands against her own face and did not make a sound, but her shoulders shook for a long time. Priest had not moved since the previous afternoon. He sat against the rear wall with his eyes half closed and the blood-dark rag loose in his hand. Lydia brought him water from the condensation drip she had caught in the skillet. He drank. He asked whether the vent was open. She told him it was. "Good," he said. "Then the air's honest." The storm broke on the 3rd afternoon. It did not end. It pulled back, the way a wave pulls back before it decides whether to return. The wind dropped from a roar to a moan. The snow thinned. Light appeared through the vent for the first time in 3 days, gray and cold, and so bright after the candlelit dark that Lydia flinched. She pulled the brush screen aside and looked out. The world was gone. The pines were buried to their lower branches. The ridge trail had vanished. The lean-to, Emery's lean-to, the 7x9 tool shelter she had slept in for 3 weeks, was invisible under a drift that had swallowed it whole. The only shape on the ridge that was not white was the dark stone of the fissure entrance and the faint shimmer of warm vapor rising through the cold air. Lydia held the thermometer outside the wall. The mercury dropped so fast she could watch it fall. It settled at 17 degrees below zero. Inside the rear chamber, the reading held 56 degrees, a gap of 73 degrees between the world that killed and the world that held. She looked at the wall. The stones had not moved. The canvas hung flat. The vent drew clean. The drainage runnel was clear. The mule stood alive in the outer chamber, breathing warm air that did not smoke. She looked at the sleeping platform. The flour sack held enough for 4 more days of half rations. The beans were gone. The salt pork was gone. The cracked corn was low. But the boy was alive and sleeping true, and the woman who had called the cave a grave was sitting beside him, and the man who had said a lean-to was not a house, was leaning against the wall with frost in his beard and wonder working through his face like something he had not expected to feel. The wall had held. The air had held. The earth had given its warmth through 3 days of killing cold without asking for anything in return. Lydia sat on the edge of the platform and rested her hands on her knees. Her hands were wrecked, split, scabbed, bruised, the right thumbnail still missing, stone dust ground so deep into the creases that it would never fully come out. She looked at those hands and at the wall they had built and at the people the wall had sheltered, and she did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the thermometer and the living child and the standing mule were not already saying louder. Outside, the valley lay silent under snow. Somewhere below, Merritt Klein sat in an office with broken windows, his ledgers frozen into a block of ice and paper. Somewhere below, families counted their remaining cords and calculated how many days they could keep their stoves burning before the wood ran out and the cold came through the walls. On the ridge above Glenwood Canyon, inside a crack in the basalt that no one had known existed until a half-starved mule pulled toward it in the dark, the temperature held at 56 degrees. The earth breathed. The walls stood. The woman who had been left to freeze sat in the warmth and listened to the silence where the storm had been, and she knew that the worst had come and the mountain had hidden her in its breath. But she also knew this was not the end. It was a door. The storm had shown 4 people what one woman's wall could do, and 4 people would tell others, and others would come asking how. The question was no longer whether Lydia Venner could survive. The question was what the survival would become. The storm broke into a hard blue morning that hurt to look at. The sky was so clear and so cold that the air itself seemed brittle, as if a loud sound might crack it. Lydia stepped through the brush screen and stood on packed snow that reached her knees. The valley below was white and still. No smoke rose from the freight road. No wagon tracks marked the snow. The world looked like something that had been cleaned and emptied and set back down without anyone's permission. Ansel Crowther was the first to leave the fissure. He stood outside the entrance wall and looked at the vapor rising from between the stones. Warm air leaking through the joints, turning to mist the instant it touched the frozen morning. The wall looked like it was breathing. Crowther looked at it for a long time. He did not speak. He walked along the face of the wall, running his hand over the upper course, pressing each stone, testing each joint the way he tested a team harness before a mountain crossing, thoroughly, because his life had depended on thoroughness more times than he could count. He found the section Lydia had rebuilt after the collapse and felt the harding packed behind it, so tight the stones might have grown together. He held the thread from his glove against the vent. It moved outward, clean draw, clean air. Then he turned and looked down the ridge toward the valley, where the rooftops of cabins along the bench were visible under their snow loads. He could see chimneys. Some had smoke, some did not. The ones without smoke were the ones that had run out of wood, or lost their chimney draft to wind reversal, or lost something worse. He turned back to Lydia, who stood in the entrance with her arms crossed against the cold. Behind her, the candle burned steady, and the thermometer read 56 degrees, and Tamsin sat on the sleeping platform with Orrin curled against her side, and Priest sat against the rear wall with his eyes closed and his chest moving in the shallow, careful rhythm that was all his lungs could manage. "I called half a cord no fuel," Crowther said. "I forgot the mountain had its own." Lydia waited. Crowther stepped closer to the wall. He placed both palms flat against the stone, the way a man places his hands on a horse's flank to feel the breathing underneath, and he held them there while the warmth seeped through the joints and into his cold, stiffened fingers. "This was not luck," he said. "Luck does not lay stone this clean." He said it loudly enough that Tamsin heard it through the canvas curtain, and the 3 men who had followed Crowther up the ridge trail heard it where they stood at the edge of the pines. 3 men who had come to see whether the widow in the cave was alive or dead, and who now stood watching warm vapor rise from a stone wall while the valley below them shivered under snow that had killed cattle, collapsed roofs, and emptied wood piles that had taken all autumn to stack. Crowther left that morning. He did not say he would return. But he stopped at the bottom of the ridge trail and turned and looked back up at the fissure entrance one more time, and his face held something that had not been there before. Not admiration, not apology, recognition. The look a man gives when he sees a thing done well enough that his own expertise cannot dismiss it. Tamsin stayed 2 more days while Orin recovered his strength. During those 2 days, she asked Lydia every question she had refused to ask before. How warm did it stay during the worst hours of the storm? How much food remained dry? Whether the flour stored in the stone niche had absorbed moisture or stayed powdery? Whether livestock could be held in the outer chamber for longer than 3 days? Whether the warm air ever smelled different at night, when the temperature outside dropped lowest and the pressure changed? Whether Lydia had ever felt dizzy or lightheaded in the rear chamber? Whether Button's waist needed clearing daily, or whether the draft carried the smell outward on its own? Whether other fissures on the ridge might breathe warm? Lydia answered everything. She showed Tamsin the thermometer marks she had scratched into the stone with charcoal, a column of daily readings that told the story more plainly than words could. She showed her the drainage runnel and how water followed the groove to the entrance without puddling. She showed her the vent and the thread that proved the air moved. She showed her the 2 flame tests that priests had taught her, 1 candle at head height, 1 at knee height, and explained what it meant when the lower flame dimmed. Tamsin listened the way Lydia had listened to priests, with the focused attention of someone whose survival might depend on remembering every detail. I called it a grave, Tamsin said on the 2nd day, while Orin slept against the warm rear wall. You called it a hole that could warm a fox and still bury a woman, Lydia said. You were not wrong about the danger. You were wrong about me. Tamsin looked at the wall. She looked at the sleeping child whose fever had broken inside a crack in the basalt because the earth held warmth and a woman held stone, and the 2 together did what no cabin on the bench had managed during the worst storm anyone could remember. Show me how to test for warm seams, Tamsin said. That was her conversion, not an apology, not a retraction, a request to learn. Lydia respected it more than she would have respected sentiment. Over the following week, as the worst of the cold loosened enough for travel on the lower trails, neighbors came. They came one at a time and in pairs, climbing the ridge trail that Crowther's boot prints had packed into a walkable path through the drifts. They came because Crowther had told them, and because Tamsin had told them, and because the story of a widow surviving the blizzard in a crack in the ground with a sick child, a dying miner, and a half-starved mule was not a story that stayed quiet in a valley with nothing to talk about except how much wood they had lost. They asked the same questions Tamsin had asked. How warm? How long? How much wood burned? The answer to the last question was the one that changed faces. Lydia had burned almost no firewood during the worst 3 days of the storm. A few small entrance fires for cooking when the wind allowed, no stove, no chimney, no 6 cords of dry pine stacked against the cabin wall and consumed at the rate of a quarter cord a day to fight cold that poured in through every crack as fast as the stove could push it back. The families with cabins had burned through wood at terrifying rates. Some had gone through a full cord in 3 days, feeding stoves that fought wind pouring through gaps in walls that were never chinked tight enough, through door frames that warped in the cold, through floorboards that shrank and let frozen air rise from the ground beneath. The heat went into the stove, out through the iron, into the cabin air, and straight through the walls into the wind. A cabin was a machine for converting wood into temporary warmth and then losing it. Lydia's fissure was a machine for holding warmth that the earth gave freely. The difference was not clever, it was fundamental. Stop fighting to produce heat. Start fighting to keep the heat you already have. One man, Duff Arnett, a rancher who had lost 4 cattle and 2 fingers of frostbite in the storm, stood inside the fissure and pressed his remaining 8 fingers against the warm rear wall and closed his eyes. He stayed that way for a full minute, his face slack, his shoulders dropping as the warmth seeped into hands that had not been fully warm since the blizzard. 60 degrees, he said, reading the thermometer on the wall. 60 degrees, Lydia said. It has not dropped below 54 since I finished the wall. Arnett looked at her. What does it cost? Stone, Lydia said. Time. Knowing where to look. She refused to sell the knowledge. She demonstrated. She took Tamsin, Arnett, and Crowther's niece, a young woman named Elspeth with steady hands and a willingness to crawl into dark spaces, up the ridge, and showed them how to identify warm seams in the rock. No frost rim on the stone within arm's reach of the opening. Mineral smell rising from cracks, faint but distinctive. Rock that fogged in cold air the way glass fogs when you breathe on it. Insects clustering near brush piles in places that should be too cold for them. Animal tracks gathering near openings that a casual eye would dismiss as rockfall. The first rule is not entering, Lydia told them. The first rule is waiting. You wait. You watch the air. You hold a flame low and watch whether it burns clean or dims. You smell. You listen for dripping or hissing. If the air is wrong, you leave. If the air is right, you go slow. If the air changes while you are inside, you leave faster than you went in. She was teaching what Priest had taught her. His voice lived in her instructions the way his hammerstone test lived in her hands, something absorbed so deeply it had become her own without ceasing to be his. Merritt Klein heard about the visitors the way he heard about everything, through the store, through the freight men, through the careful network of attention he had built to track every shift in the benchland's value and reputation. What he heard changed his calculations. A widow who froze in a cave was a footnote on a ledger. A widow who survived in a cave and drew neighbors up a ridge to learn from her was a complication. If Lydia became useful, if people owed her, respected her, needed her judgment, then pushing her off the bench became more expensive than the land was worth. Klein's leverage depended on Lydia being alone, dismissed, and disposable. She was becoming none of those things, and every boot that climbed the ridge trail made his position weaker. He did not act immediately. He watched. He counted visitors. He listened to the store talk shift from pity to curiosity to something closer to admiration. He waited for an opening that would let him reassert control without putting himself on the wrong side of a community that was learning to trust the widow's thermometer more than his papers. But before Klein moved, Priest died. After the storm, Priest and Lydia worked together for 3 weeks during the brief thaws between cold snaps. They improved the fissure. Priest sketched a design for a better windlock, 2 staggered stone walls instead of 1, set 3 feet apart so that wind entering the gap would hit the second wall and lose its force before reaching the inner chamber. An airlock built from basalt. Lydia improved his design. She added a low passage on one side, knee height wide enough for Button to duck through, so the mule could enter and exit the outer chamber without requiring stones to be pulled from the upper wall. Priest looked at the modification and nodded. "That's better than what I drew," he said. "The mule passage lets air circulate low while the walls block it high. You have made the wind sort itself." They built the second wall together, though together now meant Lydia carried and set stones, while Priest directed from the stump or from a flat rock inside the outer chamber. His coughing had worsened through the winter. He stopped climbing the ridge some mornings and sat at the trail base, sharpening her axe and her skillet handle while she worked above. On the days he climbed, he rested every 50 paces and pressed his back against a pine trunk and breathed with the deliberate, measured rhythm of a man who was rationing his own air. One afternoon, resting against a tree halfway up the trail, Priest told Lydia about Cornwall. Not the mining, she knew the mining, but the place. The rain that came sideways off the sea, and the granite moors that held the damp like sponges. His father and grandfather following tin veins through stone so hard it ate drill steel in an hour. The sound of the stamps, the great iron hammers that crushed the ore, pounding through the ground so that the whole parish shook. He told her about Butte, where the copper stink hung in the air like a second sky, and the miners went underground in cages that dropped so fast your stomach rose into your chest. He told her about Leadville, where the silver came easy and the altitude did not, and where a blast charge packed too deep blew rock sideways instead of upward and caught his left knee and ended the only life he had known how to live. I was not a good surface man, Priest said. Underground, I knew every sound, every smell, every shift in the air that meant danger or safety. Above ground, I'm just an old man with a bad leg and lungs that will not carry their share. Lydia told him that was not true. It is true enough, he said. But this... He gestured at the fissure, the walls, the warm air drifting between the stones. This is underground work done above the surface. This is the thing I know applied to a place I can reach without a cage. You gave me that. They disagreed once, and the disagreement mattered. Priest wanted to shore a loose slab near the entrance ceiling with a timber brace. A miner's instinct, using wood to hold stone the way the underground timbers held tunnel roofs. Lydia argued that the slab was stable, that the basalt was dense and fractured in large locked pieces, and that driving a timber into the crack above might loosen what was already holding by shifting the pressure, Priest insisted. He had seen men killed by rock that looked stable and sounded stable and held for years until one shift, one frost, one vibration brought it down on their heads. Lydia asked him to test it, took a hammerstone, the fourth thing he had taught her, though he had not announced it as a lesson, and struck the slab. Sound testing. A solid slab rings, a cracked slab thuds, a hollow slab echoes. The slab rang. Dense, whole, locked into the basalt around it like a tooth in a jaw. Your ears are right, Priest said. He put down the hammerstone. And I am being an old miner who fears ceilings because ceilings have earned the fear. You are being a man who wants to keep people alive, Lydia said. That is not the same thing as being wrong. He looked at her, and for a moment his face held something that was not instruction or collaboration, but simple recognition, the look of a man who has spent his knowledge on someone capable of carrying it further than he could. Priest died in late spring, after the worst of the winter had broken and the first real warmth had come. He had helped shore the loose slab. Lydia let him brace it after all, not because the stone needed bracing, but because Priest needed to do it. And he had climbed the ridge one last time to check the vent draw in the changing season. He sat down on the stump outside the entrance, the same stump where he had first told her that warmth does not equal safety, the same stump where he had watched the storm clouds build over the canyon rim. He sat and asked Lydia whether the vent was open. She told him it was. He looked at the valley. The snow had melted to patches on the south-facing slopes. The creek was running high and brown with snow melt. Aspens were beginning to show green buds on the lower benches. The world was coming back from the White Death. Slowly, the way a bruise fades, not all at once, but from the edges inward. The air's honest, he said. He leaned back against the stump and his breathing slowed and the spaces between each breath grew longer. And then the spaces were all there was, and Lydia sat beside him and did not move until the stars came out, and the warm vapor from the fissure drifted past them both like breath from a mouth that would not close. She buried him on the ridge, above the fissure entrance, where the ground was soft enough to dig in the spring thaw, and the view reached all the way down to the river. She set a flat basalt slab over the grave, the kind of stone he would have tested with a hammerstone and approved, dense and whole, and locked into the earth. The ridge held him the way all ridges hold the men who spent their lives inside them, quietly, without ceremony, with the patience of stone that has been holding things since before anyone thought to dig. The fissure breathed behind the wall he had helped her build, and the warm air drifted past his grave on its way to the cold sky. And somewhere in the draft was the last of what a Cornish miner had carried across an ocean and half a continent to give to a woman he recognized as someone who would use it right. Lydia did not mark the days after Priest's death by grief. She marked them by work. She finished the second windlock wall alone, setting the last course without Priest's voice guiding the placement, trusting her own eye for the seat and her own hand for the hearting. The wall was not as elegant as it would have been with his direction. Some stones sat a fraction too high, and one joint ran longer than she liked. But it held. She pressed against it with both hands, the way Priest had tested her first wall, and it did not move. She tested the vent. She tested the air at 3 heights. She tapped the ceiling slab above the entrance and listened to it ring. Every test was Priest's test, performed by Priest's student in a shelter Priest had made livable. The old miner was gone, but the old miner's discipline remained, and discipline does not die with the man who teaches it. 3 weeks after Priest's death, the secondary crisis came. May snowmelt poured down the ridge in sheets, overwhelming the creek cuts and flooding every low point on the bench. A dugout 4 miles south, a half-underground shelter where a family named Osser had wintered with a grandmother and 3 children, filled with water overnight. The grandmother, Nell Osser, woke to 6 inches of brown water covering the floor and rising. The children slept on a low platform that was already soaked. The dugout's single window had been sealed with rags and pitch against the cold, and the air inside was thick with damp and the smell of soaked earth and mildew. Tamsin brought the news to Lydia at the fissure. Her face carried the tight-lipped fear of a mother who could see one family's disaster and feel it pressing against her own walls. "The water is coming through the uphill side," Tamsin said. "The drainage trench they dug in the fall is blocked solid with ice and mud. The children are wet and cold. Nell cannot lift them. Asa is bailing with a bucket and losing." Lydia went. She climbed down the ridge and walked 4 miles through mud and snow melt that topped her boots and soaked through within the first half mile. At the Osser dugout, Asa Dacey and a neighbor named Horrick were bailing water with buckets, throwing it out the door in sheets that splashed back through the mud and returned through the seeping wall almost as fast as they could throw it. Lydia stood in the doorway and looked at the dugout and saw the problem the way Priest would have seen it, not as water in a room, but as air in a system. The same principle that made the fissure livable was working in reverse. Cold water and cold air pooled at the lowest point, which was the floor where the children's platform sat. The sealed window trapped the heavy damp air inside. The stove draft, uzkat if the stove was even drawing, pulled air from the room but could not pull it from the floor because the cold air was heavier than the warm air above it. The dugout was drowning from the bottom up, and no amount of bailing would fix a problem that was not about water, but about airflow. She did not bail. She opened the window. Asa protested. Cold air would pour in. The children were shivering already. The cold air is already inside, Lydia said. It is sitting on the floor where your children are lying. Opening the window lets the warm air above push it down and out. You are not letting cold in. You are letting cold leave. She opened the window. The effect was not instant, but within 20 minutes the air inside the dugout shifted. The heavy damp layer near the floor thinned. The smell changed. Less rot, more cold, cleaner. Then she took Asa's shovel and cut a drainage trench from the uphill wall to a low point outside the door, angled to follow the slope. The same principle as her fissure runnel. Give water a path, and it will take it. The trench was rough, cut through half-frozen mud and gravel, but within an hour the water level inside the dugout dropped 3 inches. She moved the children's platform to the highest point in the dugout, away from the seeping wall. She showed Nell how to test the air near the floor with a candle. If the flame dimmed or changed color at knee height, the heavy air was settling and the window needed opening wider. Nell Osser, 70 years old and soaked to her waist, watched Lydia work and said, "Who taught you this?" "A miner," Lydia said. "He said the air does not lie." By evening, the dugout was draining. The children were dry on the raised platform, and Nell was sitting with a blanket around her shoulders and the particular expression of a woman recalculating everything she thought she knew about the widow on the ridge. The community saw what happened at the Osser dugout, and they understood something the fissure alone had not fully taught them. Lydia had not merely found a warm cave and been lucky enough to survive inside it. She understood how air and water and stone and heat work together in any enclosed space, and she could apply that understanding to a dugout, a cabin, a barn, or a root cellar. The cave was not the lesson. The lesson was the physics behind the cave, and the physics worked everywhere. She had not merely survived, she had mastered. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. After the Osser dugout, the people who came to Lydia came differently. Before, they came curious, tourists visiting a novelty. Now they came needing. A rancher whose barn froze from the floor upward because cold air pooled in the low stalls. Lydia walked his barn and found 3 cracks in the foundation where frozen air was seeping upward into the building. She packed 2 of them with stone and clay and left the third as a low vent, then cut a smoke hole in the loft wall so warm air rising from the animals could pull the cold air through and out. The rancher's horses stopped stamping by the second night. A freighter whose root cellar sweated so badly his stored potatoes rotted by March. She showed him that his cellar had no drainage and no air circulation, that the damp was rising from the floor and had nowhere to go. She cut a runnel and opened a palm-sized vent at the ceiling, and the cellar dried in a week. A woman whose chimney drew backward in north winds and filled her cabin with smoke. Lydia climbed outside and found the chimney top sat lower than the ridge of the roof, so wind rolling over the roof line pushed air down the flue instead of letting it rise. She added 18 inches of stacked stone to the chimney height, and the draw reversed. Each problem was different. Each solution came from the same understanding. Where is the heat going? Where is the water going? And where is the air going? These were not questions anyone had thought to ask in these terms. They were Priest's questions, asked in Lydia's voice, answered with her father's hands. Klein's opening came during the 3rd week after the Osser rescue. He filed a complaint with the county Sprawling, such as county government existed in Garfield County in 1887. Alleging that Lydia Venner was encouraging trespass on land the Roaring Fork land and Loan Company had a right to reclaim, and that her activities on the ridge endangered families she was drawing into an unstable geological formation. The complaint was written in the careful language of a man who understood that legal documents are tools, and tools can be aimed at people. Klein did not accuse Lydia of anything criminal. He accused her of being irresponsible, which was harder to fight because irresponsibility was not a charge you could answer in court. It was a reputation you had to outrun. Tamsin heard about the complaint from the store owner's wife. She sat down at her kitchen table that evening and wrote a statement in pencil on the back of a feed bill. The statement said that Tamsin Dacey and her son Orrin had sheltered in Lydia Venner's cave during the blizzard of January 1887, that the shelter had saved her child's life, and that she had personally observed the structure to be sound, warm, and ventilated by design rather than by accident. Ansel Crowther wrote his own statement without being asked. He purchased paper from the store and wrote in the careful, blocky handwriting of a man who does not write often but means every word he sets down. His statement said he had inspected the entrance wall, tested the ventilation, and observed temperature readings across 3 points inside the shelter, and that, in his professional judgment as a man who had wintered freight teams over Tennessee Pass for 11 seasons, the shelter was more sound than half the cabins on the bench. Duff Arnett signed his name beneath a shorter statement. The cave was warm, the wall was solid, and the widow knew more about keeping heat in a room than any man he had met in 30 years of working livestock in cold country. 3 other families added their names: the Ossers, Elspeth Crowther, a freighter named Harwick whose root cellar Lydia had fixed. Klein received the statements and said nothing publicly. He stopped mentioning the cave at the store. He stopped talking about Lydia to the deputy. He did not withdraw the complaint. He let it sit on whatever surface served as a county clerk's desk, a piece of paper with no force behind it because the people it was meant to frighten had already signed their names on the other side. He had not given up. Klein did not give up things he wanted. He recalculated. He waited. He watched the ridge trail and counted the boots and thought about what the bench land would be worth when the railroad arrived in the fall. But the ground beneath his position had shifted, and he could feel it the way Lydia felt warm air through stone, a change in pressure that no ledger could record, but that altered everything built on top of it. Lydia stood at the fissure entrance on an evening in late May after the last visitor had gone and the ridge was quiet. The snow had melted to patches in the north-facing hollows. The aspens were leafing out, pale green against the dark basalt. Button stood in the outer chamber, fat now on spring grass and the last of the cracked corn, his coat thickening, his ribs long hidden. She looked at the stump where Priest had sat. She looked at the grave above the entrance, marked with the flat basalt slab. She looked at the wall, her wall, their wall, and at the second wall behind it, and at the mule passage she had added, and at all the marks of a structure that had grown from desperation into something that worked. She did not feel triumph. She felt the weight of what she carried, knowledge that Priest had given her, and that the community now expected her to share and apply and defend. She had wanted to survive the winter. She had survived, and survival had grown into something larger and heavier and more demanding than she had imagined when she first crawled into the dark with a cracked thermometer and a mason's daughter's stubbornness. The thermometer on the wall read 59 degrees, the same temperature it had read the night she first held it in the warm draft and did not believe the numbers. The mountain breathed, the walls stood, and somewhere down the valley, a man named Milo Quaid, a widowed cooper and blacksmith she had not yet met, was hammering iron pins at his forge and hearing, for the 3rd time that week, the story of the widow who had turned a crack in the ridge into the warmest room in Garfield County. He would climb the trail the following week, carrying iron hinge straps and a question about whether the cave entrance needed a door. He did not know, climbing, that the trail led to something more than stonework. Neither did Lydia, standing at the top, listening to the mountain breathe warm air into a world that was finally ready to listen back. By the second winter, the fissure had become something Lydia had not planned and could not have predicted. It had become a place people came to, not tourists, not curiosity seekers, people in trouble, families whose stoves cracked in January and could not be replaced until the freight road opened. A pregnant woman whose cabin roof collapsed under snow weight 3 weeks before her due date. A pair of freighters whose mule team broke through river ice and who staggered up the ridge with frostbitten hands and no shelter within 10 miles. A grandfather with pneumonia whose family's cabin sat in a cold hollow where the temperature dropped 15 degrees lower than the bench above. Lydia did not turn anyone away, but she set rules, and the rules were not negotiable. No open flames past the entrance wall. No digging or shifting stone without testing the air first. No crowding the rear chamber. 4 people maximum in the sleeping space, and the rest stayed in the outer chamber between the 2 windlock walls, where the temperature held in the low 40s even during the worst cold. Animals kept in the mule bay, separated from the sleeping space by the canvas curtain and the second stone wall. One person watched the vent at all times, day and night. If the thread stopped moving outward, everyone left the inner chamber immediately. No exceptions. No arguments. These were Priest's rules, refined by Lydia's experience and enforced with the quiet authority of a woman who had earned the right to say no inside a space she had built with her own wrecked hands. People who objected to the rules were shown the door. People who followed the rules were shown the warmth. The pregnant woman, Clara Stott, 19 years old and terrified, stayed for 11 days. She slept on the raised platform while Lydia slept on spruce boughs against the rear wall, waking twice each night to check the vent thread and the drainage runnel and the temperature at 3 points. Clara's husband, a timber cutter named Vern, rebuilt their cabin roof during a thaw and came to collect her with a look on his face that mixed gratitude and shame in equal measure. He had not believed the cave was real until he stood inside it and felt 60 degrees of warmth on a day when his breath froze on his mustache before he reached the ridge trail. Lydia showed Clara how to test the air in their rebuilt cabin, how to hold a candle low near the floor to check for drafts that steal heat at ankle level where children sleep, how to feel the walls for cold spots that mean gaps in the chinking, how to listen for the thin whistle that means wind has found a seam. Clara listened with the careful intensity of a woman who has learned that the world contains knowledge she did not know existed, and that the knowledge can keep a child alive. The freighters, 2 men named Polk and Garrity, stayed one night and left at first light. Lydia wrote instructions for them on a scrap of paper and pencil. How to build an emergency windlock wall using stacked stones and a canvas tarp when caught in open country. How to test air in any enclosed space with a candle flame before sleeping. How to clear drainage beneath a bedroll to keep the sleeper dry. Polk folded the paper into his coat pocket and nodded once and said nothing. Garrity shook Lydia's hand, which surprised them both. Neither man had the words for what they had felt inside the chamber, the warmth, the calm, the sense that the earth had been holding something in reserve that only needed a wall and a vent and the right pair of hands to become shelter. But they had the paper, and the paper would travel with them to freight camps and way stations where other men would read it and copy it and carry the knowledge further than Lydia would ever know. The community around the bench and the canyon road was changing in ways visible to anyone who looked. Root cellars that had always sweated were drying out, their owners having cut runnels and opened vents following Lydia's instructions. Barn stalls that had frozen from the floor upward were warmer, foundations packed with stone and clay. 3 families had built crude windlock walls across the windward sides of their cabins, angled stone barriers, not full airlocks, that broke the force of north wind before it hit the cabin wall. The barriers were ugly. They worked. A fourth family had raised their woodshed floor on stone footings after Lydia showed them that their firewood was absorbing ground moisture through the dirt floor and burning wet even after months of stacking. Tamsin Dacey had become the most effective carrier of Lydia's knowledge because Tamsin had the social credibility that Lydia, as a widow who lived in a cave, still lacked in certain circles. When Tamsin told a ranch wife to open a vent in her cellar, the ranch wife listened without the hesitation she might have shown if the advice came directly from the woman the storemen still occasionally called the Mole. When Tamsin explained why a chimney needed to stand higher than the roof line, the explanation arrived wrapped in the authority of a woman whose child had survived a blizzard inside a crack in the basalt. Tamsin never claimed the knowledge as her own. She said, "Lydia showed me." And the phrase carried more weight than any lecture because it came with a living 5-year-old boy as proof. Elspeth Crowther, Ansel's niece, had taken to the work with a focus that surprised everyone except Lydia. Elspeth was 23, unmarried, and possessed the particular steadiness of a woman who had decided early that being useful mattered more than being decorative. She spent 5 days inside the fissure learning to read thermometer marks, test air at multiple heights with the two-flame method, identify solid versus cracked stone by sound, and map a cave's airflow by watching candle behavior at each turn and depth change. She carried a hammerstone in her coat pocket after that first visit, and she used it on every cellar, dugout, and foundation she encountered, tapping and listening with the same tilted head attention that Priest had brought to every surface he tested. Lydia watched Elspeth work and recognized something she had seen before. In Priest, in herself, in the way her father had held a candle to a crack and watched the flame instead of looking away. The hunger to understand how things hold together, and the patience to learn it stone by stone, joint by joint, flame by flame. She taught Elspeth everything Priest had taught her, including the parts she had been afraid to learn, how to read a fissure for gas pockets by smell and flame behavior, how to identify sulfur concentrations too strong for safe habitation, how to distinguish a stable ceiling from one ready to calve by the sound it made under the hammerstone. The knowledge was spreading, not through books or newspapers or the kind of organized instruction that cities had and frontier settlements lacked, through hands on stone, candles in cracks, runnels scratched into floors with axe blades and picks. Through women and men who walked to their neighbors' properties and showed them what Lydia had shown them, and who said, when asked how they knew, "The widow on the ridge showed me." Merritt Klein's downfall came not through confrontation, but through the weather he had spent a year dismissing. The second early cold snap of the season, a brutal 3-day freeze in late October of 1887, caught Klein as unprepared as any greenhorn who had never seen a Colorado winter. His storage shed sat behind the company's office in the lower valley, near the road where the railroad had finally arrived that fall. The Denver and Rio Grande had reached Glenwood Springs in October, exactly as predicted, and Klein had spent the summer buying and repositioning land claims along the route. He had been so absorbed in speculation and the opportunities the rail would bring that he had neglected the preparations Lydia had been teaching the community all year. His shed had no windlock. Its walls were single-board construction with gaps at the base where the sill had rotted from ground contact. The foundation sat low, in a hollow that collected cold air the way a bowl collects water, exactly the kind of cold pocket Lydia had identified at the Osser dugout. The shed held company paper, ledgers, claim documents, correspondence with investors in Denver, and 20 sacks of grain intended for resale at rail-inflated prices, and 2 company mules stabled in a lean-to attached to the rear wall. Lydia had visited the shed in September. Not to help Klein, he would not have accepted her help, but to deliver a set of iron hinges Quaid had made for the company's stable door. While there, she had noted the rotted sill, the low-lying foundation, and the lean-to's lack of upper ventilation. She told Klein's hired man, not Klein himself, because Klein would not speak to her directly, that the mules needed air above them and that the grain should be moved to higher ground before the first freeze. Klein's man reported the advice. Klein said he did not need counsel from a woman who lived in a hole. The freeze killed both mules. They died standing in the lean-to, the way cattle die in open draws. Cold air pooled in the low sealed space, and the animals could not escape it because there was no upper vent to let the heavy cold air drain, and no windlock to keep the worst of it from entering. The grain froze and thawed, and froze again, swelling in the sacks until the burlap split and the wet grain rotted. The paper, Klein's ledgers, his correspondence with Denver investors, his carefully maintained records of debts owed and claims held, soaked when snowmelt seeped through the rotted sill and climbed the stacked document boxes. By the time the freeze broke, the ledgers were a block of ice and pulp that would take weeks to thaw and would never be fully legible again. The loss was not ruinous. Klein had other records, other assets, other mules he could buy. But the loss was visible, and in a small community, visible failure carries a weight that no ledger can calculate. At the public meeting 3 days later, called by Crowther and two other bench families to discuss winter preparations for the new settlers the railroad had brought, Klein stood and attempted to frame his losses as an act of God, unavoidable, the kind of thing that happens when weather strikes without warning. He spoke for 2 minutes in the measured, reasonable voice of a man who has spent his career making reasonable arguments for things that benefit only himself. Tamsin Dacey stood up from the back of the room. She had brought Orrin, who sat on the bench beside her, 6 years old now, healthy, eating a piece of dried apple. The boy's presence was not accidental. Lydia Venner told your man about the sill rot in September, Tamsin said. Her voice was level, carrying the flat authority of a woman stating a fact she had personally witnessed, not making an argument she needed anyone to believe. She told him the mules needed ventilation above, and that the grain should be stored higher. She told him the foundation sat in a cold pocket. Your man told you. You said you did not need advice from a woman who lived in a hole. The room went still. 12 families, 30-odd people. Some had been in the fissure during the blizzard. Some had visited afterward. Some had copied Lydia's windlocks or opened vents in their cellars or raised their woodshed floors. All of them were listening. Klein's face did not change, but his hands, resting on the table in front of him, pressed flat against the wood, and his knuckles went white. Lydia named the same act of God last month, Tamsin said, and she told you where to move your feet. She sat down. Orrin chewed his apple. The room stayed quiet for a long time. Klein did not respond. He sat down slowly, as if the chair had become heavier. He did not speak again during the meeting. He did not speak at the store for 3 days afterward. His conversion, if the word even applies to a man like Klein, was not dramatic. He did not apologize. He did not seek Lydia out and admit error. He did not become a student or an ally or a friend. What he did was smaller and, in its way, more complete. He stopped. He stopped filing complaints. He stopped sending men to watch the ridge trail. He stopped talking about the cave at the store. He stopped trying to claim the fissure sat on company-controlled land, partly because 7 families had signed a document defending Lydia, and partly because the community had watched his own shed fail for the exact reasons Lydia had predicted, and a man cannot argue with a prediction that came true in front of witnesses. Klein's humiliation was not that he lost an argument. Arguments can be relitigated. His humiliation was that the community now trusted the widow's measurements more than his ledgers. A ledger tells you what things cost. A thermometer tells you what things are. And in a country where winter kills, what things are matters more than what they cost. Milo Quaid had first climbed the Ridge Trail in June of 1887, carrying iron hinge straps and a question. He was 41 years old, a widowed cooper and blacksmith who had come to the Glenwood country 2 years before Lydia and Emery. His wife had died of typhoid on the passage through Kansas, and he had continued west because stopping felt worse than moving. He built barrels and repaired tools and shod horses in a shop near the freight road, and he kept his grief inside the rhythm of his hammer, the way other men kept it inside a bottle. Not gone, not healed, but beaten into a shape he could carry. He had heard the story of the cave from 3 different people in the same week. A freighter whose hinge he was repairing, the store owner's wife, who mentioned it while picking up a repaired kettle, and Duff Arnett, who came to have a branding iron reset and spent 20 minutes describing the temperature readings on the fissure wall instead of the usual 5 minutes of weather talk. Quaid was not interested in the story as a story. He was interested in the wall. A dry stone wall with a vent and a canvas curtain, built by a woman working alone that had held against a blizzard that killed cattle standing. That was something a blacksmith and cooper understood in his bones. Joints, pressure, the way pieces fit together, and the forces that try to pull them apart. He wanted to see the wall the way a watchmaker wants to see a clock built by a stranger, not to judge it, but to understand how someone else had solved the problems he spent his life solving with different materials. He arrived at the fissure entrance and stood looking at the stonework for 5 full minutes before Lydia came out of the inner chamber to see who was standing at her door. She saw a man of medium height with forearms like wound cable, holding 2 iron hinge straps in his left hand and a canvas tool roll in his right. His hands were burn-scarred across the backs, forge marks, the kind that accumulate over years and eventually form a map of every mistake a blacksmith has made and learned from. His face was weathered and calm, the face of a man who works hot metal all day and has learned through pain that impatience burns. "I brought hinge straps," Quaid said. "If you want a door, these will hold one." Lydia looked at the straps. They were well made, clean welds, even taper, pinholes drilled true and deburred. She had seen enough poor ironwork in freight camps to recognize good work when it stood in front of her. She looked at Quaid. "I do not need a door," she said. "The canvas works." "Canvas rots," Quaid said. "Iron does not." He was not wrong. Lydia considered this. The canvas was already showing wear where wind had snapped it against the rope for months, and she had patched it twice with scraps from the old wagon sheet. "Come inside," she said. "Tell me where you would hang them." Quaid entered the fissure and spent 30 minutes examining the entrance, the wall, the vent, and the second windlock wall. He did not touch anything without asking. He did not suggest changes or improvements. He asked questions. How the vent drew under different wind conditions, why the canvas was set at that specific distance from the wall, what the drainage runnel had done during the snow melt, what Lydia would do if a stone cracked in the upper course and needed replacing without dismantling the entire row. His questions were good. They were specific. They were the questions of a man who understood that a structure is a system, not a pile of parts. Lydia answered each one. As she answered, she watched his hands. He held them still while he listened. No fidgeting, no absent reaching, no testing surfaces without permission. A man who works with hot iron all day learns to keep his hands still and deliberate until he is certain where he wants to put them. Quade's stillness told Lydia more about him than his questions did. The hinge straps would go here, Quade said, pointing to two spots on the entrance wall where the basalt met the natural rock of the fissure mouth. You would need a plank door, hung to swing inward so wind pressure pushes it closed rather than ripping it open. The bottom gap should be 4 inches for airflow. Your canvas has roughly that already. The top should seal against a stone lintel with a wool strip for compression. Lydia looked at the spots he had chosen. They were the right spots. She had considered a door herself weeks ago and had placed it in the same locations in her mind before deciding the canvas would serve for the season. Build it, she said. Quade came back 3 days later with a plank door made from split pine, hung on the iron straps with a 4-inch gap at the bottom and a wool-stuffed strip along the top that compressed against the lintel when the door swung closed. The door opened inward. Wind pushed it shut. The fit was clean enough that Lydia could hear the difference in the chamber's draft the moment the door seated, a steadying, a deepening of the warmth, as if the fissure had been waiting for someone to close the last gap between it and the cold. He came back the following week with iron pins for securing the spruce pole sleeping platform, replacing the wedges Lydia had used. The pins held better. They did not shift when weight moved on the platform. He came back the week after that with a set of iron brackets for a storage shelf in the rear chamber, and a question about whether Lydia had considered lining the drainage runnel with flat stones to prevent the channel from silting. Lydia had considered it. She had not had the tools to cut the stones thin enough. Quade had the tools. He cut them. This was how the courtship proceeded, not through words or gestures or the careful social choreography that the century expected between a widow and a widower, but through iron and stone and problems solved. Quade courted Lydia the way he built barrels, by fitting pieces together and testing whether they held. Lydia did not want dependence. She had survived a winter alone in a cave. She had built 2 walls with her own hands. She had buried the man who taught her and carried his knowledge into a community that now came to her for help. She did not need a man. She needed a partner, which is a different thing entirely. She tested Quade the way she tested stone. She gave him instructions inside the cave and watched whether he followed them without reshaping them into his own ideas. She asked him to watch the vent for a full afternoon and watched whether he watched the vent or watched her. She told him to clear the mule's chamber and observed whether he cleared it the way she asked or the way he thought was better. He followed her instructions. He watched the vent. He cleared the chamber her way. Not because he lacked opinions. He had opinions about everything from hinge placement to runnel depth, but because he understood that inside this space her knowledge was earned and his was borrowed, and a man who cannot take instruction without taking command is a man who will eventually take the space itself. Quade passed the test by not knowing he was being tested. That was the surest sign he had passed it. They married quietly 2 years later, in the fall of 1889. No ceremony worth describing. A justice in Glenwood Springs who smelled like pipe tobacco and read the words from a book with a cracked spine. 2 witnesses, Tamsin and Elspeth, standing in a room that smelled like floor wax and old paper. A meal afterward at the one hotel in town that served food worth eating, where Tamsin ordered pie, and Elspeth ordered nothing because she was watching the street with the restless attention of a woman who had somewhere else to be. They walked back to the ridge that evening along the creek road, the aspens turning gold above them, the first cold of autumn sharpening the air. Quade carried his tool roll over one shoulder. Lydia carried a new wool blanket she had bought with money earned from consulting on 3 root cellars and a barn foundation. They did not talk much on the walk. They did not need to. The talking had been done over 2 years of iron pins and shelf brackets, and a drainage runnel lined with flat stones that fit so precisely the water ran silent. Their life together was not a romance in the way stories usually mean the word. It was a partnership made of shared labor and mutual silence. and the understanding that some things do not need to be said out loud when they have already been said in iron and stone. Quaid built a proper cabin on the bench, using Lydia's knowledge of wind and air and stone to site it, where cold air would not pool and draft would not steal heat through the walls. The cabin had a stone windlock on the north side, a chimney that stood 18 inches above the roof line, a foundation packed so tight that Lydia's candle test showed no floor-level draft on the coldest night of the first winter, and a root cellar with a proper drainage runnel and a vent that Lydia insisted be positioned exactly where priests would have put it, high on the south wall, palm wide, with a stone baffle to slow wind without stopping air. They kept the cave. It remained the emergency shelter, the warm room, the place people came when the worst weather arrived and the stoves cracked and the roofs collapsed and the cold reached deeper than wood and iron could answer. Lydia set the rules. Quaid maintained the hardware, the door, the hinges, the iron pins, the shelf brackets, the storage hooks he added as the cave's function expanded from desperate shelter to community resource. He never called the rules his own. He called them Lydia's standing orders, and he said it without irony or resentment, because he had seen what the orders protected, and he had no interest in being the man who changed them and lost someone. Years compress the way years do when the work is steady, and the seasons repeat their demands. The railroad brought growth to Glenwood Springs. The hot springs drew visitors from Denver and beyond. New settlers arrived in the valley and on the benches, some with experience, some without. The ones who built their cabins badly found their way to Lydia eventually, sometimes through Tamsin, sometimes through Elspeth, sometimes through the quiet network of people who had learned to read stone and air and who passed the knowledge sideways without ever writing it down or naming what they were passing. Lydia and Quaid did not have children. They had the ridge and the work and each other and Button, who lived to an unreasonable age for a mule, 26 years, and who spent his last winters standing in the outer chamber of the fissure, fat and calm and patient, occasionally pressing his old nose against the warm stone the way he had the first night he found it in the dark. When Button died, Lydia buried him on the ridge below Priest's grave, and Quaid forged a small iron plate and set it in the stone above the mule's resting place. The plate said nothing. It did not need to. Everyone on the bench knew whose mule was buried there and what the mule had found. As Glenwood Springs grew, outsiders tried to romanticize the story. A journalist from Denver came to write about the Widow's Warm Cave and asked Lydia to pose at the entrance for a photograph. She refused. She said the mule found the door, Rowan priest taught the danger, and the stone did the rest. The journalist wrote the story anyway, and it was mostly wrong, but the wrongness did not matter because the truth was in the walls, not in the newspaper. Lydia lived into her 70s. She outlasted Klein, who moved to Aspen when the silver boom drew speculators with shorter memories. She outlasted Crowther, who died in his sleep in his tight log house with the stone chimney, and who was buried with the statement he had written about Lydia's wall folded in his coat pocket because his niece Elspeth thought he would have wanted to keep it. She outlasted most of the men who had laughed at the store, and she outlasted the laughter itself, which faded into the particular silence that falls when a community realizes it was wrong and does not want to discuss the details. In later years, she was known less as a miracle survivor than as the woman people sent for when a cellar sweated, a wall breathed cold, or a barn froze from the floor upward. Children along the bench were taught 3 things before they were allowed to explore the ridge alone. Never enter a warm crack without a candle, never go without a rope, and never go without someone waiting outside. These were Priest's rules, carried by Lydia, taught to children who would never know the old miner's name, but who would carry his caution in their habits the way stone carries heat, slowly, steadily, and long after the source has gone cold. By the third winter after the blizzard, 11 families along the bench and the canyon road had copied some part of what Lydia had built and taught. Raised storage platforms in root cellars, vent testing with candle flames before sealing winter shelters, stone windlocks on the windward sides of cabins and barns, frost reading along rock seams, the habit of watching where ice formed and where it did not, and asking why. Not all of them had geothermal fissures. That was the point. The deeper lesson was never find a warm cave. It was stop giving heat to wind, water, and bad walls. Lydia spent the rest of her life on the bench above Glenwood Springs in the cabin Quaid built and the cave the mountain offered. She outlasted the men who had laughed at the Mule and the clerk who had tried to turn her survival into a land dispute. She died in the winter of 1912 in her bed in the cabin, with the thermometer on the nightstand reading the temperature the way it had read the temperature every night for 25 years, because old habits do not die, and the habit of checking was the first thing priests taught her, and the last thing she forgot. Ansel Crowther had stood on the stripped clearing in October of 1886 and delivered his verdict to a woman with $12 and a broken thermometer and a mule too thin to sell. A lean-to is not a house, he had said. Half a cord is not fuel. A mule is not a miracle. He was right about every word. The lean-to disappeared under snow that winter and did not reappear until April. The half cord of wet aspen rotted where it lay, unburned, unnecessary. And the mule, the stray, half-starved, nameless mule she called Button, stood alive in warm breath behind a stone wall, season after season, his nose against the rock that breathed, patient and calm and fed. Many years later, Milo Quaid replaced the old canvas curtain with a proper wool hanging. Behind it, on the rear wall of the chamber, Lydia's first charcoal thermometer marks were still visible on the stone, 17 outside, 56 within, storm still rising. The last line of the story is not a lesson or a moral or a summary. It is an image. The winter had come looking for a widow, and the mountain had hidden her in its breath. End script.